And
Okay. Jan, let me interrupt you for 1 second. Jan is the editor of the book. And so I think when we first announced the book, we didn't know Jan was going to join us. So if anyone doesn't know who's talking, it's the editor of the book that put this together. And you might tell us when you started on it and how long and that kind of stuff too.
Oh, sure. I started on it in 2017. So it was about 3 years ago, about now, in May. And we debuted it at the 1842 Inn, which is where LeROY lived, a year later. And I had one of my Achilles surgeries in the middle of all that. So, and my publisher said at the very first presentation, he'd not told me this before, but he would give me deadlines and not expect me to make them. And I beat every single one of them. And he finally asked me, how can I get through this all so fast? And I said, well, I've spent almost 20 years as a high school teacher reading kid handwriting. And this was beautiful handwriting to read. You'll see some of it in a minute. And I'm just used to going through stacks and stacks of stuff. So I just did what I do and got through it rather quickly. But the cover kind of represents the how we kind of look at the book. It's got a picture of the front of the 1842 Inn, which is LeROY'S home. And then the picture of him behind broken glass. And at the very beginning, when I started this, Ted Savas, the publisher, asked me to read all the different journals from that time period that I could. And he wanted me to find one like LeROY'S. And I'd already read several by men who rode with Jeb Stuart. That's another interest of mine. I'd read John Mosby's memoirs. I'd read a number of others which have kind of odd connections with LeROY.
Roger, I just turned the volume down because it was so loud.
Yeah, one by Annie Froebel. And if you remember when Thomas came back working for Colonel Froebel, it's actually her brother. But she wrote a very good journal as well. And there was nothing like what LeROY wrote. All of the men who wrote were involved in the war, or they were women and they saw bits and pieces of the war, kind of like LeROY did, but nothing was quite like it. And I told Ted, you know, we're getting to the end of it, and he asked me if I did my homework. I said, well, teachers always do their homework. And I said, the only one I can think of that comes even remotely close to this, but it's not a perfect analogy, is the Diary of Anne Frank. And he said, okay, you're going to have to explain that. And I said, well, they're both teenagers. They're in their late adolescence. They're extremely good writers. They're authentic writers. They give you great detail about the lives they're going through. And from a distance, they're looking at the society they knew, the world that they know, get broken apart by warfare. And in Anne's case, they were literally in an attic in Amsterdam, and she could look out windows and peek out and see what was happening. For LeROY'S case, he wasn't hiding away, but he was removed from society by his illness. And so to get that kind of looking outwards at the world kind of image, that's what Ted put together, LeROY'S picture behind the broken glass that would have represented the house, because he was not able to fully participate in society. So, but again, I thought it was a really compelling piece. As a high school history teacher, I knew from working with kids that they like reading about others, people their age in different time periods. And that can be a really good way to hook them into a topic and get them involved, because they can relate. One thing I did when I taught World War II with seniors, I didn't do this with freshmen because I thought they were a little too young for it, is I had them listen to a post-war audio from the BBC where they had children who ended up, they had been in concentration camps, and they were pretty much on their own. They had no family, and they're trying to find family, and they thought they had cousins or aunts and uncles, extended family who had made it to Great Britain. And so a couple of times a week, the BBC would broadcast the names and stories of these kids and say that, you know, this is Hans, who lived in Mainz, and he's looking for his cousin Elsa, who he thinks is in the Liverpool area. And they would give the whole child's story, how old they were. And there was one 17-year-old who had been in 5 different concentration camps, and he had been the personal valet for an SS officer. And the faces of the kids in my class were just, they were just shattered. And I said, what's going on? I stopped it and I said, what do you think? And they go, that he's our age. How could he survive something like that? I can't imagine. So that's what I was thinking this story could do as well. So that's how I got started on it, was that idea, is that it was something that kids could get into. And as I was telling Richard before, I live in an area of Northern Virginia that the kids have no idea about the Civil War history of the area. They don't know that it was under occupation for all 4 years. They don't know who John Mosby was. When I moved here, I didn't know who John Mosby was. And my kids went to Mosby Woods Elementary School. I didn't know who he was.
Great.
Because my background was mostly in the Soviet Union. But again, I thought this would be a good way to introduce them to the Civil War and like that. My co-author working on, we put together a curriculum guide to go with this book, and then we're working now on a junior version set for 5th through 8th grade. And she teaches middle school English in New Hampshire.
Wow.
So we've been working on that. We've known each other for years and years, but we've been working on that collaboratively because she knows the English education side of it, and I've written all the history lessons that go with it.
Wow.
So it's been a good collaboration, I think. So if you want me to start now, I can
I
do
think that's
that.
good. That'd be great.
Okay. Down here. Oops. There we go. Okay. There it goes. Can everybody see that?
And we're still seeing you.
Share screen. Oh, goodness. Oh, there it goes. I have to hit the share button. Can you see it now?
Yes. Well,
See that
you're
you
sharing the
started the
screen, but
screen
there's
share.
nothing on it.
Okay, can you see the whole?
Yes.
Okay, this is the only picture that we know of LeROY.
There we go.
We think he was about 10 years old when it was taken, and it, along with a number of family letters, and all 7 of the journals are in the Library of Congress. And I've not actually seen them. I worked with them from these scanned views, which was good because I had that ankle surgery. I wouldn't have been able to get in there. But they've digitized all 7 volumes, and that's what I worked from. And you can see his handwriting here on the screen. It's absolutely gorgeous. It was a delight to work with. You can read it. It's very, very clear. The only times I had problems was when they would use words that we don't use anymore. And sometimes the abbreviations were different. So I had to get used to that. But that's basically what I was working with right there. So you can see that. The diaries, I first met LeROY on Facebook. And I was on Facebook and scrolling, and in my news feed, there was an article written by a Washington Post author who had seen part of the collection at the Library of Congress when they had their sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And he gave a really good overview of it. He said it was about a young man who had somehow broken his left leg. They didn't know how. And he had some sort of disease. They didn't know what it was. And he had a lot of bed sores. And I thought, still, he talks about the wit. He talks about how intelligent he was, what it was like to read about every day. And I thought that sounded interesting. So I contacted my publisher, Ted, and said if he knew anything about it. And he said no. And he asked around. No one had ever heard of it. So he said, "You want to do it?" I said, "Sure." So as I said earlier, we started in May of 2017 and finished the bulk of the work by January. I had a surgery in February, and then was able to get down to Macon to do a book tour starting in June of 2018. He was born to a prominent family in Macon, Georgia, in I can't see what number it is, 1847, I think is what it says. Your pictures are all across my graphics there, so I'm going on memory. His father had been elected mayor of Macon twice, and he was a prominent Presbyterian leader. He had put in most of the money to build the first Presbyterian church in Macon, which is still standing. They have a lot of gorgeous churches in Macon. The antebellum architecture is phenomenal there. So they were a well-known, popular family. And he kept a diary starting in June of 1861 when he was 12. And it ended in June of 1865. And one of the unique aspects of it is that he writes nearly every day. You guys have read it. How many days did he miss? Maybe 5? He wrote every single day. And he was intelligent. He was sickly, though. And he was educated, kind, curious, and really opinionated, especially when it came to politics in general. These are his parents later in life. That's the front porch of the 1842 Inn. I've sat right there, not in that chair, but I've sat right in that spot. That's his mother, Mary Eliza Baxter. We think this is in the late 1880s due to her dress. And that's John Jones Gresham, his father. And the 1842 Inn is on College Street, which is up on a bluff. You have the nice homes that are kind of up above on a hillside that slopes down toward the Ocmulgee River. The business part of town and the railroad and the river are lower down, and then it goes up on the other side, and you have Indian mounds that are on the other side of the river, which are really phenomenal to go see too. He owned about 100 slaves on 2 plantations. They were actually side by side, but 2 different pieces of property. And they're about 30 miles south and east of Macon in Houston County. And they were called Oakwood and Pineland, but we don't know which one was which. This next picture is one of the byproducts of my having gone through Georgia and doing so many talks. I was at a, some of you are familiar in Georgia. It was in Tennell, and at one of the civic groups that meets there. And this gentleman came in with a laundry basket, and he had pictures and letters, and one of the pictures was this one.
Wow.
This is only half of the image. The other 2 women in the picture that were on the left-hand side were damaged. You can only see that they're female shaped. You can't see faces or anything. The one in the middle, if you look at the face above and the face of the woman on the left below, that's Mary Baxter. We're about 95% sure that that is her. We have some other images that we can use for comparison, but we don't know who owns them, so we can't use them in publication. But that's Mary about the time she had LeROY, or LeROY would have been a very small baby at that point. And we can tell by the dress, the clothing that they were wearing. I have a lot of friends who are into historic clothing studies, and they were able to tell me in 10 minutes. I posted in the closed Facebook group, and 15 minutes later, I had 40 emails telling me it was the late 1840s. I also know Ron Coddington, who is the editor of Military Images. He knows a lot about the photography of the era. He said, I asked him the same question. He said, even though it's hand colored, which is extremely rare, He said it was an early daguerreotype image and that it was late 1840s. So I've had it dated a couple of different ways. We don't know, but we like to think that the woman next to her is her mother, which was the only grandparent that the children had during the Civil War. It was Mary Ann Baxter, who lived in Athens, Georgia. And LeROY, you kind of get the sense that he's their favorite child. I don't know if, you know, because they loved all their children and they invested a good deal of time in their education and they were all very, very close. But it was a really close family and a close extended family. To understand who all those people were, when LeROY writes about Aunt Eliza, well, there's about, that's my cat, sorry, she's pawing my face. There's about 60, 70 women named Elizabeth or Eliza in the Gresham family tree I've developed on Ancestry. And I have 1,701 people on that family tree.
Wow.
So it took a lot of research to figure out who was who. The only 3 people I can't place in the family tree are the 3 cousins from Alabama that appear towards the end of the journals. There's nobody with the last name of Knox in the family tree. So I still have to figure out which one of the Gresham women married into the Knox family and moved to Alabama. And that could have been generations back, but they're acknowledged by LeROY as their father's cousins. This one of Thomas here, you guys have read the story, so I have to tell you what LeROY thought of that picture of Thomas.
Right.
This is the picture that he was talking about in January of 1864. Thomas was the eldest. He was born in 1844. And he and LeROY were exceptionally close. It's not uncommon for twins to develop a common language that only they understand. But he and Thomas did too, which his mother writes about. Minnie was the only daughter. She was educated at Wesleyan Female College. It's kind of like a prep school at that time. It's still a very important part of Macon life. There's a lot of women I've gotten to know who have been part of Wesleyan. I found out they were also it was the first school to have sororities, and I'm supposed to find out which one of the 2 that Minnie belonged to. I haven't been able to do that yet, but she in her own right later in life, Thomas became a lawyer. Minnie married, settled in Baltimore, and was a published author in her own right. And her middle son became an extremely influential Presbyterian theologian. She had 3 sons, and the middle one became a theologian. The 2 younger siblings died early. I talked about Edmund and the fact that Joey fixed his headstone. He lived for 7 months. He died of complications of pneumonia. And the gentleman who had the pictures, both the daguerreotype on the other slide and these 2, had a letter from John Gresham to Edmund saying that his namesake had died from complications of of pneumonia. Edward was 17 months, and we still don't know what has happened to him. I hope that it's in some of the extant letters that we still haven't been able to get through. There's a lot of material still to go through. But why the diary? Well, I found out from doing research, I found a man named Judge Ayers. He became a judge later in life, who was a classmate of LeROY'S at Mr. Bates's school.
I've lost her. Has anyone else?
Yeah, I have too.
We'll see if she comes back on in a minute. She may have lost her connection. Richard, do you have a phone number for her? You might.
I have an email address, but not a phone number.
Okay.
John, this might be an opportunity to tell everyone how to mute their Zoom if they don't know how.
Okay. I had muted most of you. I'm now unmuting everyone so we can hear you all again for the moment. I had gone in one by one to mute everyone except Carol and Richard and myself.
The mute is right there. The mute.
The mute's off mine now.
Yeah, everyone is unmuted.
John, since she's kind of left us, do we want to just discuss the book for a little bit until she comes back?
Yeah, but I would see if you can find a number for Richard.
Okay.
I don't know why I'm echoing. She probably lost her. The trials and tribulations of technology.
No, I know. I mean, there's just no way. There's no way you can ever get
Wonderful if it works.
these websites.
I told several people last week, "Hi, James, how are you?" That we would be good at this by the time.
Hi.
You want to talk about the medical book at all? Before she comes back on?
Sure. So for those of you who read the book, one of the big points of discussion is what was wrong with Wiley.
Hello?
Okay, yeah, I was just trying to call you just to figure out what was going on.
So I have medical history and wanted to see if I could figure it out by myself without being told. But of course, if you read the foreword to the book, it tells you. But there is another book.
John, I didn't mean to, can I interrupt for a minute? Do you have, I'm on the phone with Jan, do you have the meeting ID number?
Yes. It's part of the Zoom link, but hang on just a second.
I can look it up.
Yeah, there she is.
Carol,
No, she can't hear you.
Carol,
She can't hear you.
hey.
Hey, hey, Charles, hey, Kathy.
So, Richard,
Your head is.
Yes,
8630-7532-614.
thank you.
All right.
Did you hear that, Jan?
Uh-huh.
7532-614.
Maybe her cat jumped on the keyboard.
Yeah. Just
So
got
there is
killed.
a book you might think about as a
No worries.
this. You know, the last entry in, there she is. The last entry in the book is I Am
Okay.
Palestine.
There
There
we
is a
go.
companion book by that title.
Jan is back.
I'm back.
Sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
We blamed it on the cat jumping on your keyboard.
She had already done that. Here we go.
John, kitty.
Oh, crazy, crazy. Okay. Oops. Can you see now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I think we got this far. So when the Washington Post authors said that nobody knew how LeROY'S leg was broken, I was able to find out how he broke his leg. And he said he had back sores or bed sores. What happened is that he had more, there's more to it. He had oozing sores, back abscesses, and that's why his father took him to Philadelphia to see Dr. Joseph Pankos. Now, I researched Joseph Pankos, and he was one of the preeminent doctors at the time. He was one of the first to practice what we now call plastic surgery. And I don't know for sure, but I believe that what he did is he wanted Dr. Pankos to close the wounds on LeROY'S back. And Dr. Pankos told John, no, he couldn't do that. Okay, so LeROY writes about that part. He doesn't say why, but he writes about that part. And the diary was a gift from his mother. He writes at this point like a 12-year-old. Short, choppy sentences. They're very complete. They flow from one to the next usually, but it's not anything extraordinary. By the next year, though, the kind of things that teachers look for as far as a student's intellectual capacity, LeROY is starting to zoom off those charts. He's become extremely intellectual and able to process a lot of really complex concepts for someone so young. But at this point, he's still pretty much your general 12-year-old who likes to go to the Natural History Museum and see all the skulls and see things like whales and flying fish like that he spoke about. He loved to read. He read everything he could get his hands on. People would come to the house with books for him to borrow. He loved science, especially the study of astronomy. Talks a lot about some of the comets that come through that he's able to see in Macon. He also loved mathematics and worked at a level that pretty much only his brother and another young man named Jim Campbell were able to work with him, and they would send math problems to each other across town, which, being math phobic, I just have a hard time with that. But I like to think of servants running back and forth with scraps of paper with letters and numbers all over them. And he's sweet, funny, kind. You don't hear him complaining about people. He doesn't talk about how his brother bothers him or his sister's being a pest. You don't hear any of that kind of thing. He loved pets and animals. He had that whole series of dogs named after Confederate generals. He was opinionated, though. He hated that other picture of Thomas from the previous slide. And I think it was because it was not the regular happy-go-lucky Thomas that he was used to. That was a much more serious young man of 20, dressed in his first military uniform, about to go off to war. So he had a different look on his face, and I think that's what LeROY objected to. And the entries included Mark Twain-like witty phrases, and there's so many of them, which I'm sure you noticed as you were reading. I pulled this clip from the, it's another good thing about it being digitized. I could take clips from, digitized clips from the book. This is one, it was written on January 24th, 1862, and there's all that scribbling on the top of the page. And there's two people it could be. It could be little Florence, who was born on the day that LeROY'S leg was broken. Very busy day in that household. She was the daughter of one of the house slaves. And it could have been Tracy, the little cousin whose mother had died before he was 1. And LeROY'S uncle went off to war as a surgeon. I kind of think it was Tracy who did this, but LeROY writes, some jackass got his hand at this book and tried his hand at writing. And Tracy would have been about 2 at this point. But there's some things where I would be reading in the middle of the night and I would just laugh out loud. It was just really amusing. So what the diary gives us is a really unique view of Southern family life. If you've read Mary Chestnut's diary, it's highly interesting. She knows absolutely everybody. She writes about the parties and everything, but she's also best friends with Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife. So it's not your typical day-to-day life that you get from Miss Chestnut. What you get that from this, because like I said before, he hardly misses a day. He describes the food, the clothing, the conversations, the interactions, the stream of visitors that come into the house. And one of the first arguments I had with my publisher was I wanted to put in the footnotes about a couple of the people who came to the house during the presbytery in Macon, which is an annual meeting of all the elders. And he goes, they don't have to know who this Wilson guy is. I said, well, they do, because that is Woodrow Wilson's father. They get to know Woodrow Wilson's father. And the other one was the grandfather of Woodrow Wilson's first wife. And when the two married in Savannah, it was those two gentlemen who did the marriage ceremony. And Ted said, okay, you can keep them. So I got to keep them in there, because one of the last things John Gresham did was he got a job in Washington, D.C. for Mary Claire DeGreed, if you remember her, one of Minnie's friends. She ended up not marrying, but John Gresham got her a job working as a statistician for the Bureau of Labor, and she's focused on the problems of women and children in industry, which at the beginning of the 1900s was a big problem. So he was able to use those connections, some of which would have been knowing someone like the Wilsons, to get her that position. So you follow them from the peak of their influence, the very beginning of the war. LeROY forgets to write about his father buying a new buggy a few weeks earlier. And then you get to see the impact that the war had on them financially and socially as well. He talks about John Gresham buying LeROY a nutritious meal at the end of the war using the family silver. And LeROY talking about not knowing if they'll have a house for the next Christmas or what's going to become of them. All of a sudden, their life has become very uncertain. You get to see that happen. Again, I kind of spoke about this earlier, but there's a list at the beginning, the dramatis personae, which I kind of outlined the families and the major people that lived in Macon. At the cemetery, you go through the main gate, go down to where the Greshams are, you see all the names of these families as you drive past. So it's kind of a unique thing to see. The politics. He writes about Jefferson Davis and Alex Stevens as being a prime ticket. It didn't hurt that Alex Stevens was a good friend of his grandmother's. He most of the war not in Richmond, but in Athens. He was not a healthy man. But LeROY follows politics, and like a lot of my 9th grade students, when he's younger, you can hear the echo of the parent in the background. I can tell, which families are Republican or Democratic families by how the kids talk about politics in class. By the time they get to 12th grade, they've got their own opinions and can explain the reasons for why they think the way they do, and LeROY's able to do that. He despises Joe Brown from the very beginning. He does not care for him. Joe Brown has already had 2 terms of governor at that point. Elected governors then every other year. And he had already had his 2 terms, which is pretty much standard. When Joe Brown was elected the 3rd time, LeROY was kind of disgusted. And when he ended up getting the 4th term, he said it was just an embarrassment. It was just abysmal that this man was able to establish his own autocracy. And but again, he's happy about secession. He's a definite fan of Georgia and of the Confederacy, and he mocks Lincoln and Northern soldiers on a number of occasions. My favorite of which is when he's talking about the first encounter between cavalry in Northern Virginia in Fairfax Courthouse, which I'm very familiar with, and they had a number of Union cavalrymen who came in late at night, and they're just pushing to see how the Confederates were going to be able to defend the courthouse, and then they pulled back. There were some deaths on the Confederate side, and LeROY says he now knows how the Union's going to supply itself with an army. It's going to get rid of all the drunks, close up the saloons, and give the drunkards guns to shoot at women and children in Fairfax Courthouse. Of course, that's not really how it goes, but that's what happens when you have, you know, political commentary about the other side. If you've ever seen the World War II political cartoons drawn by Dr. Seuss, I showed them to my seniors one year. Again, the freshmen, they were too young for it, because there's every single nasty, ugly, ethnic stereotype of Japanese, Germans, and Italians in that. But one young man looked up at me with these big eyes and said, "Miss Croon, this isn't one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish." I said, "No, it's pretty ugly stuff." But that's political cartoon, and that's how you discuss the other side during war. And so you see LeROY doing quite a bit of that. He spent 4 years recording the entire course of the war. And again, you don't have to know a thing about the Civil War to enjoy this book, because LeROY doesn't know anything about the war either. You follow it with him as it goes chronologically, which for a teacher is great, because textbooks split it up regionally usually. They have no idea that there's any fighting except for at Gettysburg. They think there's only two generals, General Lee and General Grant, and they have no idea about how far-ranging and how encompassing this war was. But LeROY covers all of it. The footnotes, we spent a lot of time on those to make sure that they were able to help you. This clip I have here is it's when he talks about what he calls the Battle of Richmond. Well, there is no Battle of Richmond. If you read about the Civil War, you won't find one. He's talking about what we call the Battle of the Wilderness in 1862. Also later in 1862, he talks about a battle that happened not 5 miles from where I am now, called, he calls it the Battle of Leesburg. Anybody remember what it was really called? Battle of Ball's Bluff. And it was really interesting because one of the after effects of Ball's Bluff was that the Federals started having investigations into what went wrong in some of the battles. So that started their that habit of doing that. So he got news from his father, from newspapers, magazines, other adults, and he especially prized the letters that would come from his uncles, especially Uncle Edge. He's interested in Georgia troops and how they're doing. And again, you've read this, so you know that a lot of the troops were trained in Macon. Macon was a crossroads, railroad crossroads. It ended up being an important wartime town, not only for the training, but they developed an armory, an arsenal, a ballistics laboratory where they tried to develop new weaponry. The powder was in Georgia was done in Augusta. They had a powder factory there. They had a prisoner of war camp in Macon. Was for the officers, for federal officers. About 3 or 5 of the public buildings became hospitals. And the enlisted POWs went to Andersonville, and that's what gets Macon into the war itself at one point. There were 2 places where Macon was site of a battle. You can see the mood swings. They're really, you can really note them around Vicksburg, going up and down. They're gonna get them now, they're gonna get it now, and then up, they didn't. And Sheridan and the Georgia campaign are well covered, and LeROY saw some of the fighting from his roof. Now, how he got up there, I don't know, because his father was in the fighting. He was part of the civil defense. He wasn't 55 years old yet. He was 53 at the time, so he had to go. The slave that LeROY was particularly attached to, Howard, had gone with John Gresham as a body servant. So I don't know who and Thomas was gone. He was already in service. So I don't know who carried him up to the roof. There's one really narrow staircase to get up there, but he was able to see the cannonballs flying from where the Indian mounds are. That's where the Federal Army set up their cannons, and you could see them flying into town. There was only one of the residences in town that was hit, and it's today called the Cannonball House, because the cannonball came across, bounced in the front yard, broke through one of the colonnades on the house, and busted into the front drawing room as Mrs. Holt, Judge Asa Holt's house. Mrs. Holt was coming down the stairs, and LeROY remarks that the Holts left town the next day. I don't blame them. But the people there are extremely nice. It's a place you can go and see how a house would have been put together. They have some original pieces of Macon in the home, and the woman who runs it is a delight. But he got to see that. He saw that and was very excited about it. The second one was when they sent Minnie out of town. You remember that part of it. Okay, processing the news was one of the things that we found was really interesting. And this is where some of the people who pre-read the book said that as historians who look at just like the battles or the personalities of the war, they often forget that there is a home front. And this is, they found one of the most interesting parts was how the civilians processed all the information that came from the battle. LeROY quickly learns that not everything he reads is true. And his hopes get really high, like I said before, and then they get dashed by the bad news. And he learns he's got to wait for General Lee's official report or General Hood's official report, and not get so excited about the rumors that are flying. This typewritten piece here is a clipping that was in LeROY'S journals, and it comes from the Macon newspaper, and it's actually a clipping of reporting from New York. They would get to the point where they had no news, and so they would print the news they could find from the north, just trying to get everything as down as much as they could. So the scene in Gone with the Wind, where they're trying to figure out if Ashley's been killed and they're in the buggy and the lists come out, that was the only way that they could figure out how to get that information to people. The newspapers picked that up because they could pick up the telegraphic communications. And they had no real, neither army had a real decided upon way to inform people about losses like that. So it was the newspapers that did it. He learns news is often wrong, and he learns to deal with that. Often also fake news. But this one clip here I have at the bottom, I took the clips out of the journals, it was Tuesday, July 7th of 1863, and Mr. Clisby was the newspaper editor. He had come to the house, and LeROY knew that Lee had gone north again for a second time, and he wanted to know if Mr. Clisby had heard anything. Is there anything going on? What's happening with the army? And Mr. Clisby said there's been a small skirmish. LeROY writes, Mr. Clisby thinks it was not a large affair. It turned out to be the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg ends on July 3rd. It starts on the 1st, runs through the 2nd, and it ends on the 3rd. This is 4 days later, and they still don't know that it's been this major, major conflagration. So that's, you know, we live in a world where, you know, we can pick up our cell phones and see what's happening on the other side of the world. So for students, this would be really hard to wrap their heads around. That is 4 days later and they still have it wrong. But that's how it was. Slavery, again, is not something that LeROY touches on in any real depth. It's a part of the story, of course. You can tell that he's got some fondness here for some of the individuals. Look at how he wrote Julia Ann's name. And that was just from a regular sentence where he's talking about where things were happening. These are all stock images, by the way. They're not family images. But by looking at the census data for 1860, they had what were known as Schedule A, which was for white and free Black people, and Schedule B, which was for the enslaved population. So you can go into Schedule B, find the name of the overseer and the owner, and they list for you each individual. They give you the gender, the age, and degree of color, but no names. So when the people, the several people that LeROY talks about come up from, like Frank would come up and he was a carpenter, and he would do carpentry things around the house. We don't know which plantation he belonged to because we don't have names. So, and then when he sent John had to send 7 men off to help build battlements in Savannah. LeROY talks about each and every one of those men, but we don't know which plantation they came from because we don't have that information. I've been trying to find out what happened to Howard and spent one evening reading the census from 1870 for Bibb County. And my younger daughter told me I had to get a life, but I couldn't find Howard. That was the main thing. There are only 2 men named Howard, and they were actually much too young to have been the Howard I was looking for. But he mentions them by name. He obviously had affection for them, especially Howard. But his work describes how the plantations and the home in town supported one another. They produced a lot of the hogs was a big deal. How many hogs got slaughtered each year? That became wealth after cotton was no longer able to really be sold. They would bring up grain. They bring up a cow and a calf every springtime. They would bring up potatoes and ground peas, which are peanuts. And Howard taught LeROY how to plant watermelon, which was his favorite fruit, or cantaloupe, which is his favorite fruit. He talks about the price of things like that he liked, like strawberries. And he writes, I didn't mention this before, he writes about dinner, like we had a mess of strawberries for dinner. That's what they had for dessert. They had maybe ham and greens and other things that would have been normal diet, but LeROY's fixed on the sweet stuff. He has the sweet tooth. So it's important to know that LeROY's born into this, so he doesn't know anything else. He doesn't think it's a big deal, really, because that's how life was organized in the South. I did find in a letter his father wrote before the war to his mother when she was visiting in Athens, that he had gone down to Houston and he was trying to see how the spring planting was going, but it had been so rainy and he was having a hard time getting through the fields on a horse. And he said, and these they working for us, they don't even have a horse to get around on. I just feel really horrible. They're working so hard. And he goes, it makes me wish I never owned a slave. And unwritten is, you can hear him saying almost, but I don't know what else to do. This is what we have. So the only time he mentioned slavery directly was in the early part of 1865 when he agrees with his father that emancipation should be gradual. And of course, it didn't end up happening this way. You get a sense towards the end of the story what Reconstruction is going to be like, especially in the letter that his mother wrote at the end to her sister. But as you go, and of course I knew at the beginning that LeROY was terminally ill, but I didn't know with what. And I'm not a medical person. So, but I did learn from Dr. Rosbach, who ended up diagnosing LeROY for us, because neither my editor and we didn't know what it was. We found out that approximately 70% of people during this time period had what killed LeROY. Only their bodies were healthy and they could suppress it. This is something that we talk about. You know, you may have the COVID, but you're healthy, and so it doesn't really affect you like it might somebody with pre-existing conditions. Same kind of thing. LeROY's body was not healthy because of his leg injury. He was terminally ill with a form of tuberculosis, but his parents never told him. And as a parent, especially a parent of one of my 2 daughters has a lot of medical issues, I can kind of see how they wouldn't want to tell him. They wouldn't want him to lose his spirit. They wouldn't want him to give up hope. They wanted wanted to keep him around as long as possible, so they didn't tell him the bad news that he was dying. The version of his disease he has is called Pott's disease. And what it does is it goes through the body. So the reason why Dr. Rosbach couldn't seal up those wounds on his back, he probably could have done it, but the disease had to exit the body somewhere else, and it would have been made up for a lot more pain for LeROY, a lot more agony for him. So why do it? I think is what is my guess as to what happened. Just keep it clean as best you can, and that will be that. There was nothing else that they could do for him. He wrote about the symptoms, the remedies, the pain, the treatment in great detail. I pulled those excerpts out to give to Dr. Rosbach, and that's how he did his diagnosis. But it also makes the book extremely impactful for people who are studying medicine, because he's writing about symptoms. He doesn't know what he has, so he's not looking for a certain thing to happen to say, oh, I'm going to die in 6 weeks. He didn't have that sense, so he's not being influenced by the disease itself. He's just writing about what happens. So his is the only detailed tuberculosis account written by a patient in the 19th century, according to Dr. Rosbach. And the drawing in the middle comes from Pott when he wrote his paper on the disease. So it was part of his, what he had included, as well as this picture here. And you can see how the spine is curved. This may not be LeROY'S spine, but this is a person with Pott's disease. So when he starts talking about his right leg going, you can see how that might happen. The losses depressed LeROY. He writes about this. He knows he's getting depressed. As 1865 arrives, he starts taking more and more morphine. He's getting weaker and the pain is getting worse. He grew increasingly worried as his good leg starts to become useless. Of course, he's not using it, so there's a bit of muscle atrophy probably involved. But he says, you know, his leg he's not been able to use that for years, and his right leg is becoming just as bad. So pretty soon he's not going to have a leg to stand on at all. He's still got some humor through all of this. And journaling seemed to take his mind off the disease. So as he's writing, and of course I've got the handwritten documents in front of me. They're scanned, but I've got them. I noticed the handing, and even the voice in the writing was no longer his. And I was able to figure out that it was Mary's handwriting. He was dictating to his mother. And the last entry written by him in his own hand was towards the end of May of 1865. After that, it's all his mother. And then on June 8, 1865, this is another problem we had. He said, I am, and then couldn't read the third word. And that's all it was.
Yeah.
And if you look at this paper, Mary's handwriting skips. It's dark at some points, not at others. Ted was able to take his publishing software and read the nib lines in the paper. That's how we found out. He said, I am perhaps. And Dr. Rosbach finishes it with, I am perhaps dying, is what he thinks. Of course, if your son says that to you and you're a mom, you're not going to write anything afterwards. So she stopped. And then about a third of the way down the page, his father writes that on June 18th, 1865, LeROY Wiley Gresham, the author of this diary, passed away. So there were 10 days that Mary's letter to her sister was able to describe for us. So we didn't lose what happened those 10 days. And it's heartbreaking. And I hope you guys read that letter. I always have to have Kleenex with me when I do. But it is pretty heartbreaking. She said she'd lost babies before. We know she lost 2. We also know that the time that LeROY had his accident, that she was expecting a child, because John wrote to her that very morning and said that he wanted her to come home for her confinement. She never had the baby that year. So we know she'd lost live babies and then stillborn as well. And she said nothing was equal to losing LeROY. So he's chronicling the decline of the South, which paralleled his own death. And as a gentleman at a Civil War roundtable in Ohio I spoke at once said, he goes, Shakespeare couldn't have written a more perfect tragedy. And in many ways that's right, because it's all real. So his gift to history, what we remember him for, as I talked about earlier, it's the only teenage male non-combatant account of the Civil War. Anything else you're going to read that's written by a male is they would have been in the fighting. LeROY wasn't, so you get a very different picture of what this war was about, how it impacted the community he was living in. It's the only insider view of a prominent Southern family during the war. There are a few others, people who lived on plantations, written by daughters of the family, but it wasn't as complete. You don't get a sense of what daily life was like because they don't write every single day. It's the only detailed diary in the course and treatment of tuberculosis in the 19th century. Dr. Rosbach, went into much more detail on the nature of tuberculosis and its treatments and why they did some of the things they did for tuberculosis in this little a smaller companion piece. And as I spoke about before, we recognize Anne Frank as the young voice of World War II. We look at LeROY as being the young voice of the Southern Confederacy. They ended up losing in the end, but you get to see what life was like from their perspective, how devastating it was. And again, his mother's letter gives you a preview into what Reconstruction is going to be like. So you get a little bit of that as well. And then you all have my book, so I don't have to give you this page. Unless you want to get another one, I can put it back up. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Well, I got two of them, if I may. One, where did you get the photographs? And two, how did the diary end up in the Library of Congress?
Good questions. The photographs of Thomas and his sister and of the two women I took those pictures from the originals that a descendant of John Gresham's older brother Edmund had. They were in the family. People didn't know who they were. And I'd seen other pictures, so I kind of knew that, yeah, that was Thomas and Minnie. The one of LeROY is in the Library of Congress, along with the diaries and a lot of extra letters. They were donated by Minnie's family, by her descendants. So when LeROY talked about at the end about giving away his personal possessions, and that was the one thing he was angry with his mother about when he knew he was dying those last few days, is that he wanted to give away his possessions in person, and he didn't have enough time. But Minnie got his diaries in the picture. And so her family in the late 1980s donated that, along with a larger collection from the family she married into. She married into a prominent Northern Virginia family. That was all donated to the Library of Congress. So that's how it got there. And people ask me, well, why didn't the Library of Congress publish it? That's not what their role is. Their role is to conserve and hold on to documents, but not to publish them. And there were no restrictions against publishing it, so I did. Any other questions?
Jan, is there any parts of the plantations left?
We do know where they are now, based on overlaying contemporary maps with the taxation maps of the 1860s and 70s. And it's south of Warner Robins Air Force Base, which kind of, it worried me for a bit. I used to be a military wife, and I know how Air Force bases can kind of grow and expand. But it's actually undeveloped property right along the Ocmulgee River, and there's nothing there. And my publisher would love to get the funds together to do an archaeological survey done of the property to see what's there, to see if we can find out where the plantation homes were, how big were the overseers' homes, where, you know, how was it laid out? What can we find out about the life on the plantations? We would love to do that. But they're just land. They're actually called Oaky Woods by people who live in that area. And one of the plantations was called Oakwoods. So.
I wanted to add a couple of interesting medical comments.
Sure.
There are some parts of the book when he talks about, it sounds like they're taking something out of the draining abscesses on his back.
Oh.
You know, they make these comments about the issues.
The peas.
Actually, what that was is in order to keep, I don't know if any of y'all have ever had an abscess and they have a little plastic tube or a little drain that sticks out of it. So it doesn't close up because you want everything to drain out of it.
Right.
And then to let it heal shut. And what they did back then is they used peas, like hard field peas. Sometimes they would string them on a string with a needle and thread and pack them in, or sometimes they would just pack them in and leave them for a few days and then take them back out to keep an abscess open. And so when he's talking about issues, that's what he's talking about for his back.
Oh gosh.
I
can't even imagine.
Comment, but one of the things I found most fascinating in the book was right early in the book where LeROY is talking about brushing his teeth.
Yes.
He has a paragraph or two about how you need to brush your teeth up and down and you need to spend more time in the back. And he finishes it by saying, and my dentist tells me to use waxed thread daily as well. And I felt like I was reading something that could be written today. And yet that was 150, 60 years ago. So I felt like for one reason or another, dental advice hasn't changed at all in 100 years. That was amazing to me.
No, I agree with that. It's like, oh, wax thread, that's floss.
Yep.
But yeah, some things haven't changed. And again, with students, that's what they like to hear, that some things have always been the same. I can tell you who his first crush is. Just by going through it. Anybody want to guess? I think it was Mary Campbell. He'll write her name. He'll just write her name. But I think he had a bit of a crush on her. And there's the doodles, you know, some of them we put in the book. When I was working on this, I would do my first transcription and I would take these clips. I would get the clips out and I put them in right where they were in the book. And my publisher goes, "Why do you do that?" He goes, "Those are just stupid drawings." I said, "Yeah, but if I walk past any 9th grader in any of my classes, they're doing the same thing." They're doodling on the side. They're practicing their name, writing their name in different ways. And girls will sometimes have somebody else's name and then they scratch it out because they don't want anybody to see who they got a crush on. But some things are the same, and that was one aspect of it.
So do you have any insight into LeROY'S mother? Specifically, she was sick in bed all the time.
That's something that we have all these letters from the family, and then the gentleman who had the pictures of Thomas and Minnie and the mother when she was young also had additional letters that he scanned and gave to Ted. I haven't looked at those even yet. I'm going to go through there because we noticed that as well. And I don't know if it was just she had a nervous disposition or because she had maybe she had some gynecological problems that she wouldn't explain to a son. So she was in bed quite a bit. We just don't know. And there isn't a lot written about her. You can find out about what happened in the later lives of Minnie and her brother, and even some of their cousins, but not Mary. You can't, it's almost impossible to find out anything about her except from what LeROY wrote about her. So she's kind of a mystery figure. So hopefully when I'm able to get into those letters, I'll be able to find out more.
I was surprised that most of what LeROY wrote about being taken care of was about his father.
Yes.
His father doing things to his back or giving him pills or medicine.
Right.
And so I was surprised that wasn't the role of the mother more.
It may have been just difficult for her to do, to see her son in that kind of a state. Right. Yeah, I having a daughter again with medical issues, it can be really hard when you've got to do an uncomfortable treatment with your kid. It can be very difficult. So I can kind of relate to that, but somebody had to do it. The only people who physically dealt with any of his wounds was the father and the mother, sometimes Thomas, and he talks about his grandmother. And that was it. The slaves were not responsible for any of that. And Mary made a point of that in her letter to her sister at the end. But as I was working on it as well, one of the things that struck me was that he doesn't go to any of the social events. You know, he doesn't go to the weddings. He gets a piece of the cake the next day. He doesn't go to weddings. He doesn't go to funerals. When his sister gave her talk in the auditorium, he listened from outside the building. And I'm like, what the heck is that? And then when I found out he had the tuberculosis, I knew why. He couldn't go to school. He couldn't go to the church with everybody else because of the TB. His parents knew he had it, but he didn't know. But I couldn't think, you know, he had the wagon that he got around on. Couldn't think it was that big, but then when you find out what disease he has, it all makes sense. It all falls into place.
Any other questions? I see there's a question on the Zoom group chat, and somebody asked, did you discover anything interesting about Clinton, Georgia while doing this research?
Not Clinton in particular. No. I've been there.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
No, Jan, thank you very much for doing this, and we all appreciate your labor of love and spending all the time compiling them and then willing to talk to groups.
Well, it's my younger daughter said. Now, my oldest daughter lives in England, so she doesn't get to berate me very much. But my younger daughter lives in Cincinnati, and she's actually been to 2 of my talks. And she says that LeROY is the 3rd child I never had. So I said, okay, I'll take that. But he is, and if you read the book, you get attached to this little guy. And I spent a very intense year getting to know as much as I could about him. And then the 2 years since have been a delight talking with people about him. I think it's an important story, especially in today's world where people look at the South in a very, I think, a very unfortunate way, and make all sorts of, stereotypic, they've decided what they think. Seeing, what's happening with statues and monuments and like that is really sad. This puts a face on it, a real face, and I think it's important that people have that. So,
well, the book was a treat.
Thank you.
To hear you, because it sounds like you know him, like you're talking about a member of the family. So you really bring it to life. So Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you all with the nice feedback and talking with a group that's read the book. It's fun.
Been wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome. You all stay safe.
Wants to